Welcome to TruthStream. Today we are here with Mike Williams, and we're going to talk. This is going to be a zinger of an interview. We're going to be talking Beatles, Tavistock, Crowley, the entertainment world, and just how we've arrived here in the Great Reset, if you will. And Mike, it's a real honor to have you on the show. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for asking me to join you.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm excited for this one.
Yeah,
It's
so
gonna be great.
Yeah, let's just start right out of the gates. Why were the Beatles created? And then we'll just let this unfold with some of the topics that we're talking about.
The Beatles were created to shift the consciousness of the masses, our ethics, our morals, traditional values, institutionalized religion, and the controllers or the Illuminati, however you want to refer to them, they really had to focus on Christianity. They had to take down Christianity. So they declared war on Christianity on September 11th of 1962. And I'll get into more of that in a bit. So they had to dismantle the old system, the old ways, the old constructs in order to move the world in a direction where they're looking to go. Now, where are they looking to go? We have to go back to Aleister Crowley. Now, a lot of people, and there are people even in the quote truth community, that think that Crowley was nothing more than a carnival barker, but he was not. He was a very significant person, and going back into the early 1900s, he was part of the British intelligence. He worked with British intelligence during World War I. He is an occultist and a magician, and his occultism is held in very high esteem by the power elite. So I refer to the pyramid of power as where that power elite reside. Now, Crowley, going back to his works, he published the Book of the Law in 1909. Backwards, that would be the one after 909. It's the Beatles song. Crowley's very tied into the Beatles. The Beatles are very tied into Crowley, and I'll get into that some more in a little bit as well. Crowley, his ideology, he created the religion Thelema. Thelema is Greek for will, and it was all about living your will. You're not supposed to live based upon how somebody else wants you to live or how somebody else tells you how to think. You're supposed to come from within, from your own will. And as you pursue your will, he called it your pure will, that's how you should manifest your life. And no one and nothing should get in the way. Crowley had three eons. He had the eon of Isis, the eon of Osiris, and the future eon, which based upon his teachings, he would say that we are currently in. It began in the early 1900s, but it really picked up its rate and pace beginning, I put the stake in the ground with the year of 1960, the 1960s, the whole bit with the counterculture and all that stuff. So Crowley defined the eon of Osiris roughly along the lines of, or overlapping with, the age of Pisces. And he said that this was an age or an eon that oppressed and shackled humanity. Humans were not living by their will. They were dictated to, they were told what to do, and so on. They weren't free. And he had predicted, if you want to call it a prediction, that the eon of Osiris, or the age of Pisces, would end. And then we're going to go through a transition period, and that is going to move to the eon of Horus, which equates to what people are referring to today as the age of Aquarius. And in the eon of Horus, things are going to change drastically. You're going to pursue your own will. There's going to be a completely different system societally, culturally, and it's going to be very, very different. Humanity is no longer going to be shackled and oppressed, but they're going to be free. This is what, in general terms, I'm trying to get this. I don't want to go into great detail, but trying to get it as summarized as I possibly can. So from a shackled, oppressive age to one where humans are free and unshackled. And this is the umbrella. This is the timeline that is dictating everything that's going on in the world and has been going on in the world since the early 1900s, based upon Crowley's teachings. So all of this change that we're going through, one of his teachings is that in order to bring in the new, you must dismantle the old. You cannot have remnants of the old age or the old Aeon hanging around if you really want to bring in the new age. The old age has got to be erased. It's got to be eradicated. And the controllers, those who are within the pyramid, especially those that are toward the upper echelon of that pyramid, they are occultists. And the religion or spiritual philosophy that the vast majority of them subscribe to is Thelema, and that's Crowley's religion. So what they're doing is they're playing out Crowley's eons. They're occultists, which means they are involved in, obviously, the components of occultism, which would be magic, it would be ritual, it would be ceremony, it would be alchemy. And alchemy is important because that's exactly how they're going about leaving the age of Pisces or the Aeon of Osiris to move to the age of Aquarius or the Aeon of Horus. The alchemical process, there's 4 stages to an alchemical process. And so we're going through a process now. I've identified it as the Nigredo process. Nigredo is when they just start dismantling everything. And as many of your listeners probably know, I know you guys know this, what did the Freemasons say? Order from chaos. And what did Rahm Emanuel say going back about 15 years ago, right? Yeah. Never let a good crisis go to waste.
Right.
That's the same thing. They're saying the same thing.
Yeah.
And that's what we're going through right now. And unfortunately, the internationalist structure, those within the pyramid, the cultic elite, are very, very well versed and very good at what they do. Their understanding of the human psyche, how to motivate people, how to demotivate people, how to steer them in certain directions. I mean, their skills, their ability have been honed to an incredible level over the years. And a primary organization that's responsible for this brainwashing, this conditioning, and this mind control is the Tavistock Institute. Tavistock's tentacles are everywhere. They're in all the major corporations. They are in all of these foundations. Under Tavistock, you have MIT. In John Coleman's book, I think he even tucked NATO underneath Tavistock, the Heritage Foundation. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And Tavistock is tied into the Frankfurt School. It's tied into the Stanford Research Institute. These are all, folks, these are all internationalist entities, organizations that are operating to undermine and usurp the sovereignty of nations worldwide. And they have been planning this for a very, very long time. And everything they do, again, is occulted, which means dates are very important to them. Astrological events are very important to them because they believe certain astrological events, such as an eclipse, for example, has certain significance and brings certain powers to their occultism, to their magic, and to their rituals. This is why when you watch the halftime show or these music ceremonies that they have, these awards shows, it's all ritualistic. Numbers are very important to them, gematria, and on and on and on. And this is how they operate. And I know it's very difficult for people to get their heads wrapped around this because it's esoteric. And when the vast majority of the population have been pummeled with left-right paradigms and presidents and prime ministers and all of this stuff, and they're completely indoctrinated that that's the way the world works, when in fact, that is not at all how the world works,
Right.
at all.
Exactly. I got a quick question for you. I mean, Crowley was so magnificently influential in so many areas. It's scary. But as far as the military industrial complex, it would seem that Jack Parsons was the primary vehicle for, you know, the principles of Thelema and whatnot, the larger picture of what we're talking about, to enter into that structure that we've lived with our whole lives. Most people are kind of unaware of the impact, but it's really starting to show its face now.
Yes.
Largely Parsons, or do you think that that effort was started long before that? And if so, Tavistock across the pond, do you think that was the vehicle over there? Do you think, was there a larger overarching effort, or did it kind of spawn from Crowley through Parsons?
I think it originated with Crowley.
Yeah.
Okay. But I think maybe I should just say it this way. I believe there were two parallel paths. Okay. So you had Crowley running one path, and then you had the deep state, which would include Tavistock and, you know, the military industrial complex and the oligarchy and so on, running alongside. And then at some point, what happened was, I mean, this is based upon my own research. What happened was they started to come together and it merged. Okay. So whereas before it may have been running in parallel, they then decided, hey, you know what? You would make a good bedfellow because you're doing that, and that seems to be working over there, and we're looking to do this. So let's bring it together. So that's what I think happened. Jack Parsons, L. Ron Hubbard, they were disciples of Aleister Crowley.
Yep.
And Jack Parsons, before he had any kind of launch, he would recite a prayer to Pan. Okay, so why is that important? Because when we talk about the occultism of the elites and where they're going in a direction which is a return to the cult of Dionysus, the cult of Pan. It's the cult of, if it feels good, do it. It's that cult. Dionysus, as an example, was the god of revelry, wine, sex any way you like it. Okay. So they are a pagan-based mindset, a pagan-based philosophy. And I want to be clear, I'm not knocking paganism, okay? Because there are pagan practices and beliefs that they're good people, and there's nothing wrong with that, okay? But like anything else, it can get corrupted by people with bad intent. So it was Manly P. Hall in his book, The Secret Teachings of All Ages. I remember reading this years ago, and he had said that the controllers took the divine aspects of reality and they turned it dark. See? So people have a hard time with, is occultism real? Is magic real? It is. I'll give you my opinion, my perspective. Okay. It is. It is. And because it's outside of the five senses, you can't feel it, you can't hear it, you can't touch it, you can't taste it. A lot of people think, well, it just doesn't exist. Well, and that's just not true.
Yeah, whether you believe it or not, it's what they believe that really kind of has a big effect on your life, it would seem.
That's exactly right. And that's exactly what I tell people. It really doesn't matter what you believe because you don't control anything, at least right now. They control. So, if they believe in unicorns and you don't, what difference does it make?
Wasn't you mentioned paganism? Isn't as I understand it anyway, pagan would be a term for anything that isn't an Abrahamic tradition, or by extension, Hindu tradition, given that the Abrahamic tradition sort of spun out of that. But
Right.
that makes sense. Is that
Yeah, nature-based.
yeah,
Yeah, nature-based. Right.
some real
Yes,
good
and the
stuff.
Abrahamic religions, they do have ties back to the Eastern religions and Hinduism. Brahma became Abraham.
Mhm.
So we have etymology that we can take a look at. At least that's how I've pieced it together.
Yeah, makes
So
sense.
that's what it is, guys. We have to understand that there is a strategy. It's a very esoteric strategy. And they believe that they can actually shift the world into a different age and into a different eon through their magic, through their their occultism, through their rituals. But here's the thing. This is what I've deducted. None of what they do is organic. That's the problem. So when we go to the age of Aquarius, or their version of the age of Aquarius, we have to understand it's their version of it. It doesn't mean that's what the true age of Aquarius is supposed to be all about. They, through artificial means, through manipulation, through their occultism, are manipulating the natural process, or trying to, in order to define it the way they want to see it and the way they want to live it.
Right.
Now, I mentioned before the show that Crowley wrote this paper called Book 77. And it's really interesting. He calls it Book 77, but it's one page. And in that piece that he wrote, it describes man has the right to impose his will to do X, Y, and Z. It's a litany of things that man can just do. And nobody and anything can get in your way. In fact, he even writes that anybody who, I'm going to paraphrase here, anybody who tries to inhibit my ability to impose my will, I can kill them.
Mm-hmm.
But at the very end, he also says that everybody else, in other words, anybody who's not in the club, anybody who's not an initiate, anybody who's not an adept, will be our slaves. And the reason why I bring that up is because there are folks that believe that Crowley's eons and his Aeon of Horus is a good thing for all of humanity, that he's looking to liberate all of humanity. And my argument has been, I don't think so, because he's not talking to you and me. He's talking to the people that he hangs out with. And that, right? And he was hanging out with and associated with the cultic elite, the controllers. So that's where it's going. And they foresee a future where there's going to be a lot less people, plain and simple. And anybody that doesn't think that there's a depopulation agenda in place, then really you have to wake up. That's where they want to go. And the reason for that is because in order to have what they want to have, you can't have a bunch of outliers. You can't have a bunch of people who are out of step, who are cutting across the grain. So ultimately what they're looking for is a population of literalists, a population that's in the congregation and they subscribe to the tenets of Thelema, Luciferianism, whatever you want to call it. And for those that say that Luciferianism doesn't have any doctrines or holy books, I beg to differ. I would argue that Crowley's writings, especially the Book of the Law, is the basis of modern day Luciferianism. He's the father of modern day Luciferianism, and some might even say the father of modern day Satanism.
And you did talk in the pre-interview what is the difference between Luciferianism and Satanism? And then you had mentioned that, you know, the Luciferians don't like to be called Satan, so
or
something
Lucifer and Satan, for
Right.
that matter. Yeah.
right.
Yeah. So a person who considers themselves to be a true Luciferian would argue that they are not Satanists. Luciferians will argue that there's a scale, a spiritual scale and a physical scale. So physical world, spiritual world. And they would argue that that scale has to be balanced. So whatever they do in the physical world, they have to do something to equate to that, or maybe even an offset from a spiritual perspective in order to keep the scales balanced. And one question I asked one time is, well, you know, what do they do spiritually? I said, well, like, you know, I guess their spiritual, whatever they're doing goes back to Lucifer. So evidently there are some rules and laws from a Luciferian perspective where they have to keep that scale balanced. Now, they argue that Satanists don't do that. Satanists spend very little time on the spiritual side. Everything they do is geared toward physical and material world gain. So the scale looks like this. It drops. It's heavy on this side because this is everything they do is focused on material and physical world gain for many Satanists at any cost.
Okay.
Now, it's interesting. I read Anton LaVey's book, The Satanic Bible.
Mhm.
And I always recommend to people that you should read this stuff because then you can understand more about what they're really doing. And I remember when I read the book, Anton LaVey had said that all this stuff with black robes and all that stuff and, you know, and bending spoons, he was giving these types of examples. He said, you know, that's fodder for the profane masses. We spend our time trying to shift consciousness, manipulate consciousness. It's very important. Now, what Luciferians do, we talk about the will, and this is something that is, you know, Crowley's all about pursuing your pure will. Luciferians, they say what you've got to do is you have to develop first and foremost your pure will, your internal will. That is what you have to focus on. And once you master your internal will, what it is you truly desire, then you create and manifest an external world that mirrors your internal world. So there is this equilibrium between your internal will, which you must develop first, and then what you manifest externally. Now, the masses, who they refer to as the profane masses, do the exact opposite. Most people, if you ask them what it is that they truly desire or what their pure true will is, they couldn't tell you. What they do is they assimilate the external environment and they bring it in. And so when they assimilate the external and they bring it in, I'm talking about the average person, what are they doing? They're assimilating the external world that was created by the Luciferians, right? So now when you bring it in, what you're doing is you have now adopted their world. You've adopted their environment. And this is why it's very difficult. They're very good at what they do, guys. They're very, very good. They're
Yes.
unlike what a lot of people like to believe, they're extremely disciplined. They're a bunch of screwballs, okay? And you know where they want to take things, but they are very disciplined in how they go about pushing their agenda forward. And it's very, very complex. And as I mentioned before with Tavistock, their understanding of the human mind is way, way beyond what virtually most people can even fathom.
Well, yeah, let's go into that. What does the Tavistock Institute do for those that have no idea?
Tavistock, which came into being officially in, I believe it was 1921, and Sigmund Freud was their poster child.
Okay.
It was Sigmund Freud. Everything goes back to sex, right?
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
So
that
has.
yeah. So that explains a couple of things too.
Cigar is a cigar, right?
Yeah.
That's it.
But Tavistock was part of the British military industrial complex, and still is. I mean, in 1947 they became the Tavistock Institute, and over the years they have just gotten better and better and better at developing the techniques required in order to mass mind control, to brainwash, and to condition the masses. They have their tentacles in everything. They have it in all of the corporate world. They have it in the military. It's in the political world. It's in academia. It's everywhere. And in fact, I was reading in this book here. This is, hopefully you can see it, the Tavistock Institute by Daniel Esterlin. I agree with about 95% of what Daniel has in there. It's rock solid. There's a couple of things that I have an issue with. Like, as an example, he doesn't really discuss Zionism. Okay, I'll just leave that there. I think
That's
all. I think it should have gotten a mention. But in any case, if you're going to work for MI6, you have to go through a process. It's really a mind control process where there's a breaking down of the individual, breaking down their mind. Now, why would they do that? They do that to ensure allegiance to whatever the agenda is. So they're imposing these mind control techniques on their own agents from MI6. I'm just using that as an example. Electric shock, sensory deprivation, drugs, hypnosis, the whole kit and caboodle, and along with, as I mentioned earlier, occultism.
And I'm sure threatens of blackmail and threat. We hear a lot of these people that you would think would maybe make better decisions. If they do that, then either they or their family are threatened as well. And I think that's probably part of it as well.
Well, this is about fracturing the individual, and I was trying to think of a really good example of that, but it's the seed of MK Ultra, essentially, isn't it?
Yeah, it's
Right.
Multiple personality disorder.
Sure.
Ewan Cameron out of Canada, he was huge into this. He was probably, they say Crowley was the wickedest man. I don't think so. I think it was Ewan Cameron. And the testing that he put people through was unbelievably cruel, And also, a lot of folks probably don't realize that paperclip wasn't just rocket scientists.
Mm-mm.
They brought the German psychiatrists over. They brought over the German mind control program that was assimilated into the United States and into, really the West. They brought that over as well, but nobody really talks about that piece of it. They always talk about Werner von Braun and the rocket program, but it wasn't just the rocket program. And so the Germans were heavily into it. The Russians were heavily into it. And these efforts start to converge. And, by the time you get to the 1930s, the 40s, into the 50s, you have a well-established understanding of the human mind and how to break it, how to bend it, how to steer it, how to manipulate it. The television is a hypnosis box that was developed for one purpose. It was to entertain you. It's bread and circuses, but it was also to eventually to steer you and keep you ignorant, and to keep you unknowing, and keep you inactive, and keep you docile, and feeding you all kinds of stories. So Tavistock is really behind all of that stuff. Tavistock is behind the music industry. Tavistock is behind the entertainment industry. It's behind Hollywood. And it's not like some guy shows up and he's got Tavistock, on his written on his shirt. It's I tell you a funny story. I had a comment one time. And I said that the Beatles were a creation of Tavistock. They were the first pop band to be created, them and the Rolling Stones. And somebody wrote me and said, I never read anything that said that they went to the Tavistock Institute. Like they got on a school bus
Graduates.
and went to Tavistock U.
Yeah,
So
baby.
it's unbelievable.
Wow.
But they're behind all of this stuff. And so what happens is they have all of these social scientists and these social engineers. They're everywhere, and they start to infiltrate all of the the country's politics, their education system, academia, the military, and over time they really start to shape things. And the thing is, I think a lot of people are incented by the money. And so that's what keeps people incentivized to keep going with this. Because the first question you would ask is, well, how could they possibly get so much traction and be as powerful as they have become over time? And, it's money. Plus, they're working on behalf of the controllers. That the people who are controlling have been there for a very, very long time. I mean, if we go back to the Black nobility, back to the days of Rome and so on, the controlling mechanisms, the controlling apparatus that's in place, it's very, very old. And so they put these things together and they start plugging it into the different facets of society. And before you know it, it permeates everything.
And when you say the Rolling Stones were a Tavistock creation, I mean, do you think a creation or just curated by Tavistock? Is their origin story the same as the Beatles, which is pretty transparent? Or
yeah, so I haven't investigated the Rolling Stones nearly as much as the Beatles, but here's another book. Well, it doesn't not showing up very well here. So
No, it did if you just have it.
Yeah. Okay, so it's the committee of
we can see that.
The conspirators hierarchy, the committee of 300, and it's written by John Coleman, Dr. John Coleman. And John Coleman wrote about 5 books. I think this goes back to late 80s, early 90s when he wrote the book. And I think there's 5 editions. That's the 3rd edition. And in that book, Coleman claims that he was a British intelligence officer. And he walked off the plantation. And he wrote his book and he talked about the entire deep state construct, everything. And within that, and it wasn't a book about the Beatles and it wasn't a book about the Rolling Stones, but because he was talking about Tavistock and the Committee of 300, he rolled them in, especially the Beatles, as an example of a major psychological operation that was put together and created by Tavistock. So when I say created, what it means is these 4, look at the Beatles first, and we can apply this to the Rolling Stones. They took 4 guys, and these guys were groomed and handled to play a role. Now, in the beginning, did they know that this is where it was going? Or were they thinking, hey, we're getting some good breaks here and there's opportunity, so let's keep going? And this is how they do it. This is how they shape and they mold and groom people in general. But, obviously it applies to bands as well. I mean, the people make up bands. And so they create them from the standpoint of they place them where they need to be, and then they take them down a path. So in the case of the Beatles, they take them down to unprecedented success, fame, fortune worldwide. Now, that type of thing cannot happen in this world because the world, as I just took everybody through, is controlled. So the Beatles, some people want to argue the Beatles were organic. The Beatles were not organic. They simply were not organic. Because that would mean that up to a certain point, they slipped under the radar. They flew under the radar. Nothing flies under their radar.
Right.
Nothing. Especially when we're talking about the music and entertainment industry. All of that stuff is controlled. I mean, going back into the 1950s and 60s, I mean, we had something as simple as payola in order to be heard on the airwaves. If you had a record, DJs were being paid off. And that's just, that's base level stuff. So you couldn't even get your record played unless money was passing, money was transacting. Well, how do you get to be the greatest band of all time, arguably the greatest rock and roll band of all time? How does that happen? Is it because it was all organic and you were just so talented? No. There's a lot of organic, talented bands and artists and entertainers and celebrities that go absolutely nowhere.
Well, that's the majority.
Yeah.
Right. That's the majority. Exactly. Exactly. Right. That's how they dupe the inner city kids with basketball, right? They kept telling them, hey, you bounce the basketball, play basketball, don't go to school, and you can be a great basketball player. You could be a Julius Erving or a Michael Jordan. And it was a big dupe. Because when you look at professional sports as an example, when you take a look at the number of actual professional ball players, pick a sport, against a population of how many people who were really good ball players, it's a very, very small segment of the population. That applies to everything. We just think it's bigger because they're pumping it into your living room through the television set.
Right.
And that's how they condition people. That's how they condition people to make something that's really a molehill into a mountain. And we see this today going on with all of the different agendas taking place, trans, LGBTQ, and so on.
Right.
Okay, but we could talk about that, I guess, a little later. But in any case, so when I say the Beatles were created, they were created. I even argue that I believe that John Lennon and Paul McCartney, in all likelihood, were possibly in a mind control program at an early age, going back to, let's say, 10, 11, 12 years old, early teens, and then they were brought along. And it could also apply to George Harrison and Ringo Starr. But I focus mostly on Lennon and McCartney because they're presented to us as these prolific genius songwriters. Okay, so Tavistock created all this. The Beatles first showed up in Germany in August of 1960. They had very limited musical skill and they could not write music. They weren't songwriters. They were young guys. They were brought to Germany, Hamburg, in August of 1960 by their then manager, Alan Williams, who was their handler at the time. And then 4 guys that were marginal at best musicians, didn't write any music. 3.5 years later, they're in the United States, February 7th, 1964, and they called it The British Invasion, the Beatles Conquering America.
Right.
3.5 year time period, guys. How did that happen?
Great question. Yeah, I was going to say, so this leads me, and it's not just the Beatles, and you'll go into the 3 ways that these bands can.
Yeah.
But who is writing this music?
Yeah. So who's writing the music? We can go back to the days of Tin Pan Alley, right? With Tin Pan Alley, there were songwriters and they were generating songs for various artists and entertainers and so on. So that model really didn't change. Now, with the Beatles, you will read about research where it says that Theodore Adorno, who was with the Frankfurt School, Adorno was also tied into Tavistock. And I also believe that he was connected at the hip with another social scientist at Tavistock, Willis Harman. And Adorno was an accomplished musician, composer. And there's theories out there that Theodore Adorno was the primary songwriter and person behind writing the Beatles music. Now, I did a presentation, a 4.5 hour presentation going back to April of 2020, where I went through the title of the presentation is, Did the Beatles Write All Their Own Music? And then I released an addendum to that this past April called The Addendum, Did the Beatles Write All Their Own Music? So what I did was, there was information I didn't have 3 years ago, and then I covered that 3 years later, right, to kind of, catch up.
Sure.
Now, Adorno was a social scientist. He thought pop culture was useless. He goes back to the Frankfurt School, which is interesting because the Frankfurt School is socialist in its philosophy, and he's also a prolific author. Now, whether he wrote all his own books himself, that's another question. He taught, he lectured, he had, he was on TV for a while and so on. But he was a critical thinker in the realm of the counterculture, social sciences, if you will. A critical thinker, and as I mentioned, a musician, a songwriter, a composer. Now, when I looked at Theodor Adorno, I thought that with everything else he had going on his plate, I didn't think that he was the primary songwriter. So what I deducted, the way it worked with the Beatles, was this way. Adorno was overseeing the Beatles' psychological operation, the PSYOP, or the Tavistock initiative, known as Beatlemania and the Beatles. He was working very closely with George Martin. George Martin is very, very important in the Beatles story, and not just because he was their producer. So between Adorno and George Martin, they were directing and managing the psychological operation, with Adorno and George Martin in all likelihood contributing to the music, but not all of it. So I believe what they did was, they had no more than a handful of crack songwriters, composers, that were dedicated to the Beatles initiative, working through George Martin and up through Theodor Adorno. And they were writing the music. And the elephant in the room came, the way I came about this was the Rubber Soul recording sessions in 1965, okay? So the official story tells us that the Beatles came into the Rubber Soul sessions starting on October 11th of 1965 with no backlog of music. They had no songs written. Maybe a little tidbit here or there, but no songs written. And between October 11th of 1965 and November 11th of 1965, 30 days for when these sessions were scheduled, they had to write 16 original compositions in 30 days. Write them from scratch, rehearse them, arrange them, record them, and mix them down in 30 days.
Man, wow, that's a lot.
Okay. So I deducted that that was not possible. It wasn't possible. It's a ridiculous story. I mean, just to be honest, because as a songwriter myself, that narrative says that whatever song they started, they completed. There were no starts, there were no stops. You didn't scratch anything. You didn't say, oh, this is not working. Let's try something else, Paul. Or let's try something else, John. That means everything they touched started and completed. It's just, and 4 of the songs were recorded on the very last day, on November 11th of 1965.
Interesting. Wow.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's a, see, the thing is, the way these official narratives work, and I'm just, we're picking on the Beatles now, but it's in general, this is how it works. They rely on the masses not having any expertise or understanding of how these things work. And so people just adopt the official narrative, the story that's given to them, and they embrace it. And then they just say, well, they were just geniuses. They were prolific genius songwriters. That's how they were able to do it. Nobody else can do it, but they could do it. And people, of course, adopt that story. And I've always told my audience, look, I used to believe this story. It wasn't until 2016 that I started to figure out that this story was filled with holes. And that's how long I've been looking at the Beatles, since 2016. So we're talking about 7 years. But here's the real kicker. So for people who want to argue that, yeah, you can write 16 songs, you can rehearse them, you can record them, you can arrange them, all that stuff. You could do that in 30 days, which I will argue is not possible. Especially when we're talking about the quality of the songs, guys, right?
Yeah, this is just 16 garage songs that are,
Right. We're not talking about throwaways and junk tracks, stuff like that. We're talking about pretty much 16 solid tracks. Here's the big problem. The big problem is this. The Beatles finished up recording on November 11th, 1965. The lacquer, which is the acetate, which is needed in order to press the records, wasn't completed until November 17th of 1965. They had to have the record in stores by December 3rd of 1965. So from the time the lacquer was cut, pressing the records to December 3rd of 1965 was 2 weeks. How could that possibly have happened? Because if they did 4 songs on the last day, recorded 4 songs, George Martin couldn't have possibly have had the run times for the songs yet to do the sequencing.
Right.
You need the sequencing, because without the sequencing, folks, when we talk about run times and then sequencing, it's to determine how many songs are on side A of the album and side B of the album. So you don't have too much dead wax and all of that stuff. It's got to be, it's got to be done properly. So George Martin couldn't possibly have had the sequencing done until the earliest November 12th. Well, in my research, I found that the official story says he did the sequencing on November 16th. So if the sequencing was completed on November 16th, when did they submit the work order to get the record sleeves printed with the names of the songs, sequenced, and the record labels, the labels that go in the center of the 33 RPM records, or the 45, because the 45 they released was Day Tripper and We Can Work It Out. How did they get the printing done?
Wow.
Right? They couldn't have done the printing. It couldn't have happened. It didn't happen. So what does that tell you? That tells you that the labels, the record covers, the sleeves with the sequencing of the songs on the back, the record labels with the sequencing of the songs on side A and side B, they were done. They were done way in advance.
Well, it tells me you're a damn good researcher.
That's pretty good.
Wow.
Well, the thing is, I spent time in the studios going back to the late 70s, early 80s. My brother he had a home studio in Maryland back in the 1990s. I have a home studio now. The thing is, songwriting is a process. It's a process, okay? Recording is a process. And part of that process is rehearsal. It's producing. It's all of this stuff. You just don't slap things up and walk away from it. So what happened was, because now I said, all right, the labels, because when you press the records, the labels are not put on the records. They don't stick on. You don't do them later. Right. The labels are pressed at the very time that the records are stamped. All right, the machines put the labels in, records are stamped. That's how they're produced. So the labels had to be in-house with all the names of the songs sequenced when they started pressing the records, which was probably around November 17th. Let's say he finished the sequencing on November 16th. The next day, if he really hustled it along, and he got the first batch of records out. But in order to get that first batch out, you had to have record labels and you had to have record covers and sleeves to put the records in so you can sell them. The artwork had to be done. So how did it work? While the Beatles were out doing their live gigs, their tours, and while they were on the film set in 1965, it was the movie Help, George Martin had his cadre of songwriters submitting songs. And he selected what he felt were the best songs suited for this album, Rubber Soul. And he brought in studio musicians. And they recorded the songs, right? So the songs were written. George said, okay, these are the songs, probably working with Theodore Adorno, right? Sheet music was created. Sheet music was given to the studio musicians, and the instrumental tracks were completed. So they have the names of the songs. They have the sequencing. Now they could create the labels. They can create the covers of the records, the jackets with the songs on the back, and the instrumental tracks are done. Now, what did the Beatles do when they came in on October 11th, 1965? They didn't record the instrumental tracks. They were done. So when they came in, they had to learn the songs that were recorded. And there were probably guide vocals, scratch vocals that were put in so that they could learn the melody of the songs.
Right. Wow.
So what the lads did for 30 days was to learn the vocals and put the vocals down. That's what they did. And so when they finished up 4 songs on the last day on November 11th, 1965, they finished up singing the vocal tracks for 4 songs on that last day.
Because everything else was taken care of.
Everything else was done. The instrumental tracks were done. They were down. So all George Martin had to do at that point was to mix the vocals with the instrumentals. That would be the final mix down. Then you send the lacquer off. The lacquer gets cut. And by the way, the lacquer has to be approved. It has to be tested and all of this stuff.
Right.
Right? Even printing, right? Printing has to be proofed. Got to make sure there's no typos and all of that stuff. That's what happened. And I have some folks who contacted me in the music business. And one person in particular told me, it's done. He says, you figured it out. You figured it out. And he said that anybody who goes forward trying to tell this, I call it the Cinderella story, is at some point that they're going to have to address what you put out there, Mike. Because under the normal process, if they didn't have everything pre-recorded and pre-printed, the process to cut a record after you get done recording is at least an 8-week process, 8 to 10 weeks, let's say. And when I did the calculation, when I gave them the benefit of the doubt, I said, let's just say they pulled out all the stops and they were able to do everything in 6 weeks. That still put them way beyond December 3rd.
Right.
It was only one way they made December 3rd because they had to get the record out for Christmas season. That's what they were doing. There's only one way they could have done it. And that's what they did. And that's what they did with all of the records from the first album to Revolver. The Beatles released Revolver on August 5th, 1966, and they went on a tour right after the album. And guess what they did not do during that tour? They did not play one song from Revolver. You record a brand new album, you release it, and right after you release that album, you're sent out on tour and you don't play one track. You don't play Taxman?
That doesn't make any sense.
Does it make any sense?
Is it because they didn't have time to learn it?
Yes, they didn't have time to learn it. So they weren't taught the songs. They weren't taught how to play them. They knew how to sing them, but they didn't know how to play them. And I also calculated that between 1962 and 1966, there was something like, let's just say, 90 songs that the Beatles wrote between album tracks and singles. And when you go back and you look at their live performances, they played about 25 of those original compositions. What happened to the other 60, 65 songs? And many times, like if you go back to the Revolver, the tour they did after Revolver, they went back to songs that they played on their second album. They did 2 covers. So why would you do that? Well, the answer is you wouldn't do that if you were actually the songwriters and the musicians on the tracks. Bernard Purdie, do you know who Bernard Purdie is? Bernard is a legendary drummer. He played with Aretha Franklin for 25 years. Bernard is still alive. Back in the late 1970s, Bernard said that he drummed on 21 Beatle tracks.
Oh, wow. The final recordings.
Yes, he's on the final recordings.
But he's not listed on the final.
No, he's uncredited because we get Ringo's Starr.
Right.
Bernard has not changed his story in 45 years. In fact, he released a book, I think back in 2014 or so. It's titled Let the Drums Speak. He has an entire chapter dedicated to what he refers to as the Ringo Starr controversy. In a Red Bull interview that he did in the early 2000s, I think it was around 2004, he was asked about his statement that he drummed on 21 Beatle tracks. And he didn't back off. He said, I drummed on 21 Beatle tracks. And he said, I got the tapes were sent over, and I actually did the drumming in the Capitol Studios in New York. And half the songs came in with no drum track. And I guess the other half must have had maybe a draft or a placeholder drum track on it by some other studio musician. And they had Bernard do his thing. And then he said in that interview that there were 4 drummers on the Beatles' music. And he's talking about between 62 and 66. And he said, Ringo was not one of them. He said, Ringo made his money playing live, but he wasn't on those early recordings. And then there's another great session drummer out of the UK, Ronnie Verrill. And I was conversing with a lady, and I knew that that she knew a lot. You know, sometimes you get these emails and you just know that the person that's communicating with you knows a lot more than what they're saying.
Right.
And so after I released my first presentation, Did the Beatles Write All Their Own Music, back in April of 2020, she wrote me and she said, Mike, now that the cat is out of the bag, Ronnie Verrill was a relative of hers. And she said, Ronnie drummed on their tracks as well. So Ronnie was hired as well. So we have Bernard Purdie, we have Ronnie Verrill playing on Beatle tracks. And of course, the official story tells us that 2 songs, P.S. I Love You and Love Me Do, George Martin, their producer, hired Andy White to drum on those 2 songs. And I believe that Andy White was not just hired for 2 songs. I think Andy White was probably hired to drum on the entire first album, if I had to guess. And people have asked me, well, who do you think the 4th drummer is? I don't know. I said, you know, it could be Hal Blaine from the Wrecking Crew. But here's an interesting clip somebody sent me about 3 weeks ago. Glenn Campbell had his show during the 1970s, the Glenn Campbell Show. And Glenn is introducing Cream. And he says, 3 guys, you know, Jack Bruce, Eric Clapton, Ginger Baker, that are top-notch studio session players who have recorded for the Beatles. And then he lists a couple of other bands. And it just like rolled off his tongue. These guys played on the Beatle tracks. I'm thinking to myself, well, maybe the other drummer was Ginger Baker.
Right.
Right. Clapton played on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. And if you guys are familiar with Beatles songs, if you go back and listen to Old Brown Shoe, the song off their Hey Jude album, I always thought that lead sounded like Eric Clapton as well. That sounded to me like Eric Clapton Strat. It sounded like him playing. You know, and so people ask me, who do you think some of the studio players were? Well, there's Vic Flick, a great session player out of the UK, who was in the George Martin Orchestra, so that was convenient.
Right.
Big Jim Sullivan, who was also a professional sitar player. I believe he is the person that played the sitar on Norwegian Wood. Jimmy Page is another. You know, Page was a session player starting at age 17. I don't know if a lot of people know that.
I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah. Page was a session player. Eric Clapton did a lot of session work and so on. And so it's a very interesting story. So I really went off on a tangent there on you guys.
No, that's an
It's fine.
amazing
Yeah.
tangent. That was awesome.
Well, that's why when I say that they're a creation of Tavistock, that's it really when you think about it. The songs were written for them. The final recorded tracks, it's highly unlikely, in my opinion, between 62 and 66 that any of them are on those tracks. The Beatles could play their instruments. They could play guitar. They could, they can play the drums and the bass, but they were not session players. And, the way the business works is you don't jerk around with people that can't nail it. I mean, you're going to bring in these top shelf, these top notch players to get the job done. And in the US, that was the Wrecking Crew. And they are on virtually the vast majority of the pop records from the 1960s and 1970s. They were LA based.
Wasn't there a documentary called The Wrecking Crew?
Yeah.
Yeah. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. And so if you watch, I tell my audience all the time, just if you don't believe me, just watch that documentary. They're telling you how the record industry worked in the 1960s and 70s. And I tell them, if you want to know how it worked after the 70s, from 1980 on, watch the documentary Hired Gun. That's what happened then. There was a shift where the session guys then formed and became part of their own bands. So they can do their own recording. They could play on their own tracks because they were the same guys that were playing on other people's tracks.
Right.
They had the chops to do it. So in any case,
no, that blew my mind. I got just and then how you went into the drummers backing it up. If anyone had any questions, I mean, that's an amazing story. And I know you want to get in because we're curious about how these bands, how they get in, whether it's through the bloodlines or whatever. I'd love you to go into that topic as well. Is there anything else?
Well, yeah, just before we get too far beyond this.
Yeah.
You're hearing this and you're thinking of the audacity that they would, I mean, so many obvious flaws, and still everyone's buying this for decades. But then look at all these other hooks.
Yes,
they know that people are just, as soon as you reach consensus, that's it. Nobody's asking any questions.
Yeah,
they found passports on the sidewalk. 9/11.
Yeah.
That didn't raise any eyebrows.
The buildings were incinerated, but we have a fully intact passport.
Yeah. And then Tower 7, it just fell. I mean, no one's asking these questions because no one looks beyond consensus.
No, and that's the thing.
Care, because if you do,
you're
scolded by everyone else. It's like Plato's cave. In every instance, you're going to get clubbed to death for pointing out the passport or the drummer or whoever it might be. So,
trust me,
labeled a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah, I'm not on a lot of people's Christmas list. I can tell you right now, I am not. It's it's a cult. It really form cults. That's what they do, and it's not just with the Beatles, but they Tavistock and the Deep State, they formulate a cult mentality. And like you guys said, they embrace things. People embrace stories without really critically thinking through them, the flaws that are in these stories. And that's the thing. Once you dig, what happens is, you probably found this yourself. These stories unravel pretty quickly. Like, you start to get a lot of questions. Okay, hold on a second. How could that possibly have happened? You wait, there was a fire on the 7th floor on building 7, and that took down the entire building.
It doesn't make any sense.
When the people get so emotional about it, it's like, you would question the official story that, like, where's your patriotism? Come on, that's horrible. And it's like, patriotism is not believing a lie. I mean, or
patriotism
or 100 lies or 1,000 lies.
Patriotism doesn't mean you're in bed with the deep state's stories. Question everything. Question everything. That's what I try to explain to folks. You have to question everything, and people are aghast about the Beatle conspiracy that I take them through. They don't like it because it was the soundtrack of their life.
Sure.
And they look at the Beatles, and not just the Beatles, but the Rolling Stones, just pick a band, as gods. heroes. They worship them. And as I said to my audience, it's a great story, okay? Who doesn't want to believe that story? Who doesn't want to believe that 4 working class lads out of Liverpool connect with a record store owner who then gets them signed to EMI under the tutelage of a George Martin, and then they go to unprecedented fame and fortune and write some of the greatest pop music, rock music of all time. Who's going to say, "Oh, I hate that story"?
Well, and here's the other thing on that. I started playing. I was on a porch, and these guys bass and vocals, and you're thinking, oh, and then that's the model, right? So you're thinking Beatles, Pearl Jam, Nirvana, or whatever.
Right.
And you're thinking, well, this is how it's done, and this is how so if I just do what they did, which is a complete lie, and then you're basing what your future and your vision is off something that's not real. So it's really double dipping if you're in the arts, if you're in music and acting and stuff that that I'm still doing, even at this point in my life. Don't even know exactly, at this point I just feel at times I get excited and inspired to do it, and it's really interesting to look back on all that and feel like, well, who were my role models? Because if these guys are all a bunch of lies, it's crazy. It's hard to wrap your head around even still after you learn all this shit.
Yeah, people tell me my music. People say to me, "Oh, Mike, your music has a Beatlesque sound to it." I said, "Well, I used to say I was influenced by the Beatles, but now I say I'm influenced by Tavistock." My friend John Neems. John is also a songwriter. He's really good as well, and we both say that. We get a chuckle out of it, because we were completely deceived. The world was deceived, and we're deceived every day on every front. I mean, the event that took place on March 2020, that is a gigantic deception.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So if they can pull that off, you're going to tell me they can't pull something off like telling you that the Beatles wrote all their own music, but they actually didn't? Well, in fact, that's a lot easier to pull off than I would say than what took place in March 2020, to be honest with you. Because there had to be a whole lot more people involved to memorize the script and do what they did to the world.
Well, look at even J6. Even when they screw up at every turn, and it's very poorly orchestrated, people are still buying it. It's insane. It's absolutely insane. And you mentioned other bands, and I was thinking of Led Zeppelin as a great example, and a tie-in with Crowley. Via Page, but really all. Oh,
yeah.
Joe told me they didn't write most of their music.
Well, there's a lot of evidence out there that they ripped off a lot of the old blues songs.
Like at least I've seen a video, and it's like it was 20 of them.
Yeah. Bring It On Home. Bring It On Home was like, I couldn't believe it. I watched that video as well, and I think I put up on my blog a number of years ago. Obviously there were songs that they did write, but they did rip off a lot of the old blues stuff, and I guess they got away with it because that stuff wasn't copyrighted or the copyrights had expired. But it's kind of shitty to do something like that and at least not acknowledge the original songwriter, whether there's a copyright or not, versus what they did. They just plastered their names on the credits.
Right.
That was. Well, by the way, Page and Bonham and John Paul Jones, they were studio guys. I mean, so what they played on their records.
Right. Right.
But obviously they plagiarized as well.
Yeah. Well, it brings up. There's a gentleman that I did an interview with, and the new Depeche Mode album. They've never, and he's a huge Depeche Mode fan. And he's listened, and his brother met the band about 10 years ago, and people are reaching out to him going, wait a second, there's 4 songs on the new Depeche Mode album that sound not just influenced, but the timeline, the chord changes, all that. And it's almost like they plugged in Chat GPT and did, and now they put on new vocals, etc. And we can't prove this, but he goes through it. He talks about that. But then I think of how in our face this is, with all the human trafficking that we're seeing in the world. And I brought this up. You too writes a song called Mothers of the Disappeared. Where are they on the front line standing up for kids that aren't, that are trafficked? That's what, I've seen U2 16 times. And I think, it's one thing with Zeppelin, obviously it seems like they come across in a way that they may not be worshiping Jesus Christ, if you will. But with U2 and these spiritual songs, etc., like, but Bono being so obviously part of the Illuminati, that's what's really messed with me. It's like, wait, here's these guys, the four guys, they form at a school together, and they write, this is nothing against U2's music, but then you see Bono doing all the Illuminati shit, and it took me a while. I didn't want to believe this shit. He's like, the world you think you're living in, the world, and I'm starting to look.
He's mad at me about it.
Yeah, I'm like, what? Don't fucking ruin U2 for me. I'm like, this is my. But then it's like, then I start seeing all the Illuminati shit, and I'm just like, fuck, he's right.
Yeah,
you can't unsee it. That's for sure.
You can't unsee it. And I, we're probably ruining people's perceptions of these bands too. But sorry, folks. But this is the world we live in, and we got to know what the hell's going on. So.
Question everything, folks. That's the question. Everything. The Beatles, from my perspective, they are a big example of how deception takes place. But there are many, many other examples of deception. Everything's an official narrative when you think about it. Everything's a story. And then they throw these stories out there, and then people take to the stories. They don't, like we said before, they don't research, they don't look into it, they don't critically think. They just take whatever it is that comes out of the idiot box in their living room, or whatever they're reading in a magazine or a newspaper or listening to on the radio or a magazine. And they embrace it, they adopt it.
As
and
fact.
Then they go about their lives as fact. Yeah. They just take it, and and people are they idolize and they worship celebrities, entertainers, singers, songwriters, politicians, Silicon Valley quote icons, everybody's got a hero, somebody that they idolize. And when I tell my audiences, look, you want to worship somebody, worship yourself. And what I mean by that is invest in yourself. Invest in yourself. Be your own authority. Be empowered. Critically think. But I'm derailing you guys here. I know we're probably getting short on time, but you wanted to talk about the three tiers that I mentioned before we started.
We got about 20 minutes. So we're going about an hour and a half on this one, because you're blowing our minds here. And so, please.
Hopefully this is just part one.
Yeah.
Because
we could probably, if we do a part two, we could talk about the replacement of biological Paul McCartney, because the guy running around today as Paul McCartney is not Paul McCartney.
Wait, don't you have that book that he's written next? There it is.
Well, and Crowley appeared on one of their album covers, right?
Yeah, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band.
Yeah.
And can you see this book?
I can see it. Well, we can
see Billy.
Pull it back just a little bit. No,
right in front of your face, it'll work, I think.
Yeah, maybe right in front of your face.
There. Well, there's Billy.
Okay, so the book is titled The Memoirs of Billy Shears.
Okay.
Written by Thomas E.U. Harriot.
There we go. Now we can see it. Okay.
It's classified as historical fiction, but the book is loaded up with an immense amount of information that could only be known by somebody that was there. Okay. Now, it does have threads of fiction, because Billy, Tom is actually the ghostwriter / encoder. And the reason why he's called an encoder is because the book is encoded, and you have to decode the book to get further into the truth. And we could save that for maybe another show.
Right.
But we'll just call Tom the ghostwriter for now.
Okay.
So Billy, this is his memoir. Now he's going to be 86 years old this year. He's 5 years older than biological Paul.
The one who's actually playing these shows.
Guy is actually playing Paul McCartney.
Right. And I do want to let the viewers know, in Sgt. Pepper, it says, "Let me introduce to you the one and only Billy Shears."
Billy Shears, right. So, and people will say, no, that's Ringo singing that. Ringo's Billy Shears. No, it's not. They had Ringo sing the song, right, as a deflection, but they were introducing Billy as a new band member.
Right.
Okay. That's what they were doing.
right in our face.
And we could talk a lot more about Billy. I've spent a lot of time, researching him and getting into his whole thing. But yeah, so the book gets into tremendous amounts of detail. And it was after I broke my research, which broke the myth of the Beatles writing and recording all their own music, that the book then included in its footnotes information that validated what I reported, what I put out. Okay. Over the years, the author, Tom Uhari, and I are friendly. I mean, we're not like best friends. We've become, good acquaintances, and we communicate via email periodically. And it's really a professional relationship. So if I have questions about the book, I will reach out to him. And there's only so much he can talk about because both he and obviously Billy have signed non-disclosure agreements. There's contractual secrecy types of agreements. And so Billy's got to steer away from certain topics. But that being said, he drops enough clues in that book that if you're intrepid enough, you'll piece it together.
Wow.
666 pages. It is an occulted book.
Oh my God.
It's a Masonic book, but an eye opener, a total eye opener. And so I've been digging into it, and I used the book really for me was foundational. In other words, it was a starting point, and then the book actually advocates that you go outside the book to do additional research in order to tie back to what the book is saying, to either prove it or disprove it.
When was it released?
Originally, it came out in September of 2009.
Oh, it did?
Yes.
Oh.
So it's been out for 14 years. But there have been, I would say, probably 5 updates, editions that have come since 2009. The most recent was, I think, April or May of this year. So some more information. Tom put some more information in the book. But yeah, it's well worth reading if the McCartney conspiracy or the Paul is Dead conspiracy or the Beatles conspiracy, for that matter, means something to you. And there's a lot of esoteric stuff in the book. He talks about Crowley, talks about the Aeon of Horus and all of that stuff as well, because Billy plays an important part in that piece we spoke about before we got started. And I don't think I mentioned this on the show, but I call the Beatles the Pied Pipers of the Aeon of Horus. Maybe I did say that before.
Oh.
But yeah, so they had the baton. They were at the front of the parade from a music perspective for pop culture to move people across that threshold from the Age of Osiris or the Aeon of Osiris to the Aeon of Horus. And Billy himself is an occultist. And if you read the book, you'll get that in spades. But we could talk about that if you decide to have me back or whatever.
Oh yeah. Definitely. We're going to get more requests to have you back. Yeah, but we'll finish with the 3 ways that people get involved in the music industry or bands, if you will.
There's Beatles question that I have. So allegedly they had a handler, an MI6 handler, who was known only as the name Maxwell.
Maxwell Knight.
Yeah, Maxwell Knight was the name.
Well, Maxwell Knight was the MI6 agent that some believe was involved in the death of biological Paul McCartney.
Right. Which is backed up in 107's book, A Kid by the Side of the Road, in 1966. So
yeah, so
something else to look in.
I was contacted by somebody. This is a crazy story, going back about 4 or 5 years ago, and they said to me that they attended a soiree that included military industrial types, Silicon Valley, and he said that there was this one guy that was there. He had a Texan accent, Texan drawl, and he was talking to like 3 other guys. And this guy that wrote me said he was there as part of the conversation. This guy talked about how they took original biological Paul McCartney out, how how they killed him, and he said it was a car crash, but it was a calculated accident. In other words, they forced the accident to make sure that the accident took place. And then afterwards, this guy told me that this guy had said that they made sure that if the car crash itself didn't kill him, that they made sure he was taken out, right? So people can use their imagination as to how that takes place. You can watch a number of movies on Netflix and you can figure it out. But so that was an interesting story that came out, and yeah, and there are some researchers that say that Maxwell Knight, in fact, the book mentions Maxwell Knight in an encoded way. So it's possible that he did have a part in the death of biological Paul McCartney.
And could he have been the other Maxwell?
Well, Robert Maxwell, but I think that would be a stretch. Ghislaine's.
Oh yeah, no, yeah, I don't. I would. Yeah, I didn't think of Robert Maxwell. No, Maxwell Knight was the MI6. He was an MI6 agent,
Right.
and a famed one. He was Maxwell Knight is the what 007 is
Right.
Right.
kind of modeled after.
Right.
And what would the motivation have been to take out Paul? I mean, I know why I would do it, but
It was.
sorry,
You don't like the Beatles?
I couldn't resist. No,
He's never been a fan.
It was, in my opinion, based upon the research, the book, and working with other researchers, it was a ritual sacrifice. So what is referred to in the book as death for success. So it's like the 27 Club. In other words, they give their life for the fame, the fortune, and for their name to live on, forever and ever. But the thing is, the book says that Paul McCartney and John Lennon entered into a Faustian bargain October of 1963. But they were young guys, like you're talking like 20, 22 years old, and they didn't know what they were getting into. But they were incented, right? So what they did was they came out with Please Please Me. That was their first album. Hugely successful. Tavistock, EMI made sure it was very successful. And then they dangled the carrot in front of them and said, you like all of this success? It's great, right? All of the money. Well, there's more of this, like a lot more, but we got to do a little something first. So what do you think? And so the book, the way the book tells it, the Faustian bargain was in October of 63. So Please Please Me was released in March of 63. So 7 months later, they do the pact. And then they moved on to the second album with the Beatles, which was released in the UK on November 22nd, 1963, which was the same day that JFK was assassinated. And I realize there's some people that think the JFK assassination was a hoax, okay? But I'm just saying, mapping it to that particular event, whether you believed it happened or not, November 22nd means something, right?
Right.
And it's an occulted date, obviously, because 11/22, when you add the numbers together, numerology wise, is 33. So the premise being that his death was a ritual sacrifice for the success, not just of the Beatles, that's implied, but the success of the psychological operation that was going to make them the Pied Pipers of the new Aeon, to ensure that this happens and this takes place. The transition from one Aeon to the next. I'm telling you, folks, it's all occulted. I know it sounds like crazy shit, but
but that's a pattern, right? I mean, it wasn't just Paul. It was, look at all the different celebrities. Kelsey Grammer had, they've all had relatives die mysteriously or violently.
Or Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones.
Right. There's always a sacrifice.
Keith Moon of The Who.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
John Bonham of Led Zeppelin.
Yeah, this hasn't been brought up before that I've listened to, and I even think of Ian Curtis from Joy Division. I mean, did he really hang himself? That's the story,
right?
I don't know.
Right, Kurt Cobain shot himself.
Yeah,
this ritual stuff takes place, and as disturbing as it is, and it's very uncomfortable for so many people to even think about that these things go on. they do go on. And with more and more of the pedo stuff that's coming out now, and the sex trafficking and the human trafficking that's just bursting at the seams now, it should be a validation point for a lot of people that when we talk about ritual sacrifice, that this stuff does take place.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Well,
Anyway,
yeah, let's finish up with those just so people can understand how, bands get involved in this.
Oh, yeah.
yeah, okay. So, folks, I have, this is my deduction by doing the research and just digging in. Okay, so there are 3 tiers, if you will. So the first tier are people, artists, entertainers, and so on, who are bloodline. So they have bloodline connections back into the pyramid of power. People with that type of connection are set up very early in life. They are identified and tapped to be put in very influential positions later in life, positions of power. So as an example, the guy I was just talking about who's playing the role of Paul McCartney, Billy Shears, Billy is bloodline. He's Scottish, number one. And he actually, the book tells us that he went through ritual programming, trauma-based programming, in order to groom him to be where he is today. So when they talk about this grooming process and the trauma-based mind control goes both ways. It could be very rough, bad stuff, but there's also rewards. And so they work it from both angles. The example I use is the kid whose father is the team's football coach. And of course, the father wants his son to be the best ball player on the team. And if during a game, his son fumbles the ball and the other team picks it up and runs for the winning touchdown, his father comes down on him very, very heavy, right? It's like, hey, you embarrass yourself, you embarrass me, you embarrass the family, and now go out there and I want you to run around the block 5,000 times, do 6,000 push-ups, and I want you to think about what you did and never do it again, right? That's trauma-based mind control. People never put it into that category, but that's what that is. That's shaping that kid's head.
Right.
Next game, he intercepts the ball, runs it down for a touchdown. His team wins. Now what happens? Father takes him and says, son, you were outstanding today. Just outstanding. You made me proud. You should be proud. The team is proud. That's part of the programming. That's part of the shaping and the grooming. So in any case, that's the bloodline aspect of it. And they, in all likelihood, do go through these trauma-based mind control programs in order to shape them to think the way they need to think in order to move the agenda forward. They can't have anybody walking off the reservation and, any of that stuff. The second tier below that would be people that are bound by secret societies. So they have their oaths, which in Freemasonry is called their obligations. And because of this, there is a very, very, very high probability that they are going to stick to the program because they're in the brotherhood and they get rewarded handsomely for it. The other thing in Freemasonry, if a Mason does walk off the reservation, it's called feeding pearls to the swine. Ooh. And when that happens, they are excommunicated from the brotherhood forever. And they are told, you now go live with the profane. So all the benefits of being in the secret society or the brotherhood completely evaporate overnight. Your career evaporates, your network evaporates, any business types of stuff that you were benefiting from, that goes away. So the rug just gets pulled out from under them. So if you're very successful and things are going really well, the odds that you're going to walk in the other direction are very, very low.
Yeah, not a lot of incentive to leave.
Not a lot of, exactly, right? So you just do your thing and you get rewarded for it.
A theme in the John Wick films, I might add.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's how I've deducted it works. Now, the third tier is where you have somebody who's not bloodlined and they are not in a secret society. They just have some talent, or there's something about them that these handlers, which, Tavistock has these resources everywhere, scoping out like a pool of resource to pull people in. And, maybe the person is a good songwriter. Maybe the person is a good musician. Maybe they are a good actor, or, maybe they just have a look. Maybe there's something about their look that they can exploit, that they can develop, and that they can use to develop and put forth, and I should say, push the agenda forward. And so they bring them in, and there's a lot of carrot dangling there as well. So they start here, and then, hey, you want more? Okay. So then we're going to do this, and then we're going to do that. That's how a lot of them wind up getting extremely compromised. Extremely compromised. I remember I had an interview with what was his name? Anthony. I forgot his last name. He passed away a number of years ago. But in any case, he told me that the guy from Hustler magazine.
Oh, Flynn? No.
Yeah.
Flint.
No.
Larry
Yeah,
Flint.
Larry Flint. He said that Larry Flint used to have these parties out in California, and he had all of these two-way mirrors, and he had all these hidden cameras, and a who's who would show up at these gigs that he was throwing, and there was all kinds of like crazy shit going on, and old Larry had it on film.
Epstein style, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he had them, and so they become compromised. So these types of things take place. Now, if you don't take the bait, then you'll only go so far. And in a lot of cases, what happens is, they just kind of move you out. They bring somebody else in. But, not everybody takes the bait, but those that do, they wind up in compromising positions, and they wind up doing and saying things that they probably normally wouldn't say or do.
Right.
Advocating things that they wouldn't advocate.
Yeah, that's the blackmail component I was referring to earlier, but this is more applicable in that situation. So,
well, this third category sounds like every child Disney star
Right.
that's gone on to be a drug addict or a suicide or whatever. Yeah.
Right. I mean, the example I used going back into the 1960s, I was looking a little bit into, not a lot, but into Janis Joplin, and she grew up very poor, and she was abused that way. I mean, she was brought into the system, and she was elevated to a certain point, and then 27 years old, she's out of here. She joins the 27 Club. But they still hold her up as a pop icon, music icon from the counterculture from the 1960s, right?
Yeah.
But Janis Joplin was used and abused. It happens all the time. And so, I don't know. It's don't do it. I'm an independent musician, songwriter, and you don't get your notoriety that way, but at least you have freedom. At least you don't have to be looking over your shoulder and worrying about what somebody else wants you to do, wants you to say, or whatever, or bastardizes your music.
Right.
You don't have to worry about that.
Well, with the world we're moving into, maybe there might be options for those of us that didn't play that game that are doing this with integrity. And so we'll see what happens. But Mike, this has been awesome. Really eye-opening. We'd love to have you back, and we'll go deeper down the rabbit hole. But in closing, where can people find you and your work and your music and whatever you want to tell them?
It's just go to just go to my hub website. Tongue tied there. My hub website is Sage of Quay, SAGEOFQUAY, sageofquay.com. If you go there, all of my links are there to all of my platforms. I'm on YouTube, BitChute, Odyssey, Brighteon, and also my music platforms are up there. And I also have a whole section dedicated to getting your toes wet with regard to the Beatles conspiracy. So I have some videos there that you can watch and listen to get an understanding of what it's all about. And so if it interests you, it is a huge rabbit hole, but very intriguing.
Indeed. Well, everybody, thank you for watching TruthStream with Joe and Scott, with Mike from Sage of Quay. So
yeah, I've enjoyed this immensely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm
Yeah, you guys
hang
are great. Thank you.
really looking
Yeah.
forward to the next one.
hang
Yeah.
out after.
Yeah, stick
Okay.
around for a
Take
minute.
care, everybody. Appreciate you.
Thanks,
Bye.
folks.